When I moved into her quiet old townhouse, I expected rules and rent. Not a landlady whose smirk could undo every ounce of my composure. She said she liked her tenants bold, and somehow I couldn't stop proving her right. I first met Marianne on a late summer afternoon, when the heat still clung to the walls and the city hummed with distant traffic. The townhouse stood on a quiet corner. Tall windows, ivy creeping up the brick, sunlight painting golden stripes across the hallway floor. It felt like a place that carried memories, the kind that stayed even after people left. She appeared before I could even knock, the door opening to reveal a woman in her mid-40s, composed yet effortlessly warm. Her presence filled the doorway in a way that made the air shift slightly. She wore a cream blouse, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hair pinned up loosely as if she hadn't expected company yet was always ready to meet it. Her eyes, soft brown and perceptive, studied me like she was reading more than just a potential tenant. She was reading temperament, honesty, maybe even heart. I fumbled a little with the folder in my hand, and she smiled. Not the polite kind people give strangers, but one edged with amusement. "You ask a lot of questions," she said after I'd inquired about the heating, the neighbors, the lease terms. Her voice carried a teasing calm, low and steady. "I like my tenants bold, like you." For a second, I thought she was joking, until she tilted her head slightly, the faintest smirk curving her lips. It wasn't flirtation exactly. It was confidence, the kind born from knowing who you are and how people respond to you. That line echoed in my mind long after she showed me the room. The place was modest, a sunlit corner with wide windows overlooking a row of sycamores. I tried to focus on the space, but my attention kept drifting back to the sound of her footsteps behind me, the gentle rhythm of her words as she pointed out small details, the scent of her perfume, faint jasmine with something sharper beneath, lingered whenever she moved closer. When she handed me the keys, our fingers brushed. It was brief, barely a moment, but it sent an uninvited pulse of awareness through me. She didn't seem affected, or maybe she hid it better than I did. "You'll settle in quickly," she said, her tone friendly yet professional. Then she paused at the door, looking back once more. "And if you need anything, don't be afraid to knock." Bold tenants usually don't wait long. That smirk again. Small, knowing, impossible to forget. As she walked away, the echo of her heels followed me up the stairwell. I stood by the window of my new room, the lease signed and the sunlight fading, but her words replayed like an unfinished melody. There was something both inviting and dangerous in them, a kind of challenge I hadn't expected from a woman like her. And though I didn't fully understand why, I already knew. She wasn't just my landlady. She was going to change the way I saw everything about closeness, restraint, and the quiet electricity that lives between two people who should probably stay strangers but won't. The days that followed fell into a quiet rhythm. Work, meals, sleep, repeat. But somehow, Marianne's presence threaded through it all. Even when she wasn't around, I could feel her in the details of the house. The faint floral scent that lingered in the hallway, the tidy order of the kitchen shelves, the soft music that occasionally drifted through the floorboards from her living room downstairs. At first, I told myself it was simple curiosity. She was my landlady, after all, a figure of authority, maybe even friendship, nothing more. But the truth was subtler than that. There was something about her stillness, the grace in her movements, that drew me in. She carried herself like someone who had lived long enough to stop performing for anyone. It was during one of her casual visits that I began to notice how my composure unraveled in her company. She'd knocked on my door one evening to hand me a misdelivered envelope, something trivial, but she lingered just a moment too long in the doorway. "Mind if I come in? I could use a cup of tea," she said, her tone light, almost offhand. I remember fumbling to clear space on the small dining table, embarrassed by the mess of books and open notes. She didn't seem to mind. She sat with easy poise, legs crossed, eyes scanning the room as though every object told her something about me. "You read a lot," she remarked softly. "That's good. Most people stop asking questions once life gets comfortable." Her words carried weight, the kind that stays in the air after silence falls. We talked for a long while, about art and travel and how both of us secretly liked rainy days. She laughed at one of my awkward stories, and I caught myself watching her more than I should have. The candle on the table flickered gently, casting amber light across her face. Her laughter revealed faint smile lines at the corners of her mouth, lines that made her more beautiful. Not in spite of time, but because of it. Every gesture she made felt intentional yet effortless. The way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the pause she took before answering a personal question, the low timbre of her voice as she recalled a trip to Italy years ago. I found myself leaning closer without realizing it, drawn in by the quiet gravity she exuded. When she finally stood to leave, the room felt emptier than it should have. "Thank you for the tea," she said, slipping her shoes back on near the doorway. "You're good company, you know that?" The words hit harder than they should have. As she turned to go, the lamplight glowed softly on the curve of her shoulder, her perfume trailing after her like a whisper. I watched her descend the staircase, every step measured, graceful. That night I couldn't focus on my work. The house was silent except for the ticking of the wall clock. Yet it felt alive, as if her presence had left a warmth behind. Somewhere between curiosity and admiration, I realized I was already thinking of her too much, and deep down I suspected she knew it. Rain has a way of softening the world, of blurring sharp edges until everything feels closer, quieter. That afternoon, the storm rolled in fast, soaking the street outside before I'd even realized the windows were open. I was halfway through closing them when a knock came at my door. Firm, quick, familiar. It was Mary Ann, standing in the hallway, rain dripping from the edges of her umbrella. Her hair was slightly undone from the wind, strands clinging to her cheeks. "I didn't mean to bother you," she said with a half-laugh, "but the delivery boy left my groceries at your door again. I think he's developing a crush on the wrong tenant." I smiled, stepping aside to let her in. She hesitated for a heartbeat, then crossed the threshold, shaking droplets from her sleeves. The scent of rain followed her, clean, earthy, threaded with the faint jasmine that had become unmistakably hers. We sorted through the bags together at my small kitchen table. The sound of rain against the windows filled the silence between us, rhythmic and intimate. She reached for a carton at the same moment I did, our fingers brushing. It was such a small thing, an accident, but it changed the air instantly. I looked up, and she was already watching me. There was no teasing smirk this time, only stillness. The faint rise and fall of her breathing matched mine, the space between us narrowing with every unspoken second. She broke the moment first, clearing her throat gently. "You really don't have to help with all this," she said, her voice quieter now, as though afraid of disturbing the fragile calm. "I don't mind," I managed. "You've done enough for me already." Her lips curved, not into that confident smile she wore so easily, but something softer, more vulnerable. "You're kind. That's rare." For a moment, neither of us moved. The clock ticked once, twice. Then she stepped back, almost abruptly, as if catching herself. She gathered the remaining bags, her composure sliding back into place like a mask. "I should go before the ice cream melts," she said lightly, though her tone didn't quite match the words. I offered to walk her downstairs, but she shook her head. "It's fine. You'll only get wet again." When she left, I stood at the door, watching her retreat down the dim hallway. Her silhouette blurred through the rain-streaked glass of the entry window, elegant, untouchable. Yet even as she disappeared from view, I could still feel the ghost of that accidental touch, the warmth that had passed between us like a secret neither of us dared to name. That night the rain kept falling. I lay awake listening to it drum against the roof, wondering if she was doing the same. There was something dangerous about that thought, and something beautiful. For the first time, I realized this wasn't just admiration anymore. It was longing, quiet, persistent, and impossible to ignore. It happened on one of those nights when the air felt thick with possibility, quiet, humid, waiting. The city had gone dark after a sudden power outage. From my window, I could see faint glimmers of candlelight flickering in other apartments, but the world below seemed hushed, suspended. A soft knock broke the stillness. When I opened the door, Marion stood there, holding a half-burned candle in one hand and a bottle of red wine in the other. The golden light trembled against her skin, outlining the contours of her face, the gentle curve of her jaw, the calm intelligence in her eyes. "Seems we've been forced into a blackout dinner," she said, her voice carrying that familiar mix of humor and grace. "Mind a little company?" I didn't even try to hide my smile. "I'd be honored." We sat across from each other at my small dining table, the candle between us. The rest of the house was dark, shadows pooling in corners, yet somehow it felt more intimate than any daylight could have made it. The storm outside had passed, leaving behind only the occasional drip of water from the gutters and the low hum of silence. She poured the wine carefully, her fingers steady. "Funny how the quiet can feel louder than noise," she murmured. I nodded. "It's like everything you try to ignore finally finds room to speak." She looked up at me, then really looked, and for a moment I saw past the composure. The candlelight caught something tender in her expression, a kind of weariness hidden beneath elegance. "Do you ever get tired of pretending you have it all figured out?" she asked softly. The question hung there, heavy and raw. I answered honestly, "All the time." She let out a low, quiet laugh. "Good." I was starting to think I was the only one. She leaned back in her chair, eyes unfocused, voice drifting. "People think strength is about having no cracks. But sometimes, I think it's about knowing you'll fall apart, and showing up anyway." Her honesty disarmed me. It made her seem not older or distant, but entirely human, vulnerable in a way that made my chest tighten. The candle sputtered once, and her face flickered in the changing light. I don't remember reaching across the table, but I remember her hand, warm, hesitant, brushing against mine. Neither of us spoke. The silence was enough. Her thumb moved slightly, tracing the edge of my palm, then stopped. A breath passed between us, fragile, charged. She withdrew her hand slowly, almost regretfully, the motion so deliberate it felt like an apology. When she finally rose to leave, she smiled faintly. "Thank you," she said, "for the quiet." After she left, I sat in the dim room for a long time, watching the candle burn lower, the wax dripping onto the tablecloth. I realized then that what we shared wasn't a moment of weakness. It was the first real truth either of us had dared to show, and somehow that felt far more intimate than anything else could have been. The morning after our candlelit evening felt strangely hollow, as though the house itself had exhaled and emptied. I woke early, restless, listening for the faint sounds that usually came from downstairs. The clink of her teacup, the creak of the floorboards. But there was nothing, just silence. I told myself it was coincidence, that she was busy or asleep or had gone out early. But by noon, I noticed the shift. Where she would once knock softly to drop off a bill or a note, she now slid envelopes quietly under my door. No casual good morning. No shared tea. No flicker of that gentle warmth she'd allowed herself the night before. When I finally saw her again, it was 2 days later in the garden behind the townhouse. The air smelled of damp earth and lilac. She was kneeling near the roses, trimming away dead petals, her sleeves rolled high, her movements precise and deliberate. I hesitated before stepping closer. She heard my footsteps and looked up, her face unreadable. "You startled me," she said, though her voice was calm. "I was starting to think you were avoiding me," I replied, half smiling to ease the tension. Her hands paused mid-motion. For a heartbeat, she said nothing. Then, quietly, "I wasn't avoiding you. I was just reminding myself of boundaries." The word stung more than I expected. Boundaries. It sounded sterile, like a fence built around something once alive. I wanted to ask if she regretted the night before, that fragile human moment, but the vulnerability in her eyes stopped me. She was struggling too. I could see it in the way her breath caught, in how her knuckles whitened around the shears. "I crossed a line," she said at last, her tone almost a whisper. "I let myself forget that you're my tenant, and You're more than that," I interrupted gently. "You know you are." Her eyes lifted to meet mine, and for an instant, all the distance she'd tried to build crumbled. The emotion there wasn't rejection, it was fear. The kind that comes from wanting something you're not supposed to want. She exhaled slowly, setting the shears aside. "You're young," she said softly, as if reasoning with herself. "And I should know better." I took a small step forward. "I'm not asking for anything, just honesty." She looked at me for a long time, then smiled. Not her teasing smirk, but something sadder, gentler. "Then here's the truth," she murmured. "I haven't stopped thinking about that night. But I can't afford to keep feeling this way." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with what neither of us dared to name. The wind stirred the branches, scattering rose petals across the grass like small pieces of surrender. Before walking away, she turned once more. "Please don't make this harder than it already is," she said. I wanted to promise I wouldn't, but standing there, surrounded by her scent and the sound of her fading footsteps, I knew it already was. And for the first time, I understood distance could hurt far more deeply than closeness ever had. The silence between us lasted for days. Not quite absence, but something quieter, heavier. I heard her moving around downstairs sometimes, the faint rhythm of her footsteps, the creak of her balcony door opening late at night. It became a strange comfort, knowing she was still there even if she wouldn't speak to me. That night I couldn't sleep. The city was restless, wind rattling leaves, a distant siren echoing through the streets. On impulse, I stepped out onto my small balcony, drawn by the cool air and the soft hum of night. That's when I saw her. Marion stood on her own balcony just below mine, a glass of wine in her hand, her hair loose for once, falling in soft waves over her shoulders. The dim glow from her living room framed her like a painting, quiet, lonely, heartbreakingly beautiful. For a long moment I didn't say anything. Then softly I called her name. She looked up, startled, then smiled faintly. "Couldn't sleep either?" I shook my head. "Seems like the house doesn't let either of us rest." Her laugh was low, tired. "It does that sometimes." She lifted her glass in a half-toast. "To sleepless tenants and stubborn landladies." I hesitated, then went downstairs and knocked on her door. She opened it without surprise, as though she'd known I would. "You're persistent," she said, but there was no resistance in her voice this time, only resignation, maybe even relief. The night breeze slipped through the open balcony doors, carrying the faint scent of jasmine and rain-washed stone. We stepped outside together, side by side. The city stretched below us, lights flickering like a quiet heartbeat. For a while we didn't speak. She sipped her wine, eyes tracing the horizon. Then, almost to herself, she whispered, "You make me feel seen." It wasn't loud, wasn't meant to be dramatic, but it was the most honest thing she'd said to me since that night by candlelight. I turned to her. "You deserve to be." She looked at me then, fully, and something shifted. Her guard, so carefully built, finally cracked. Her eyes softened, and for a heartbeat, the age, the rules, the walls, they all vanished. There was just her and me, standing close enough for our arms to brush. The wind grew cooler. She shivered slightly, and without thinking, I took off my jacket and draped it over her shoulders. She didn't protest. Instead, she pulled it tighter around herself, her fingers brushing mine in the process. A fleeting, wordless thank you. We stayed like that, watching the city in silence. There was no confession, no rush of declarations. Just the quiet knowledge that something real existed between us, fragile and unspoken. After a while, she sighed, turning to me with a small smile. "You should go before the night gets any heavier," she murmured. But her eyes lingered on mine, and her smile didn't fade. When I finally walked back upstairs, I realized her warmth still clung to me. Not just from the jacket she wore, but from the moment itself. It wasn't closure, not yet, but it was understanding. And somehow, that felt like the beginning of something neither of us could deny anymore. Morning came softly, the way it does after a long, uncertain night. Pale light spilling through thin curtains, the sound of sparrows outside blending with the gentle rustle of wind through the sycamores. I woke earlier than usual, drawn by something I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the sense that something had quietly settled inside me overnight, that the storm, in both of us, had finally passed. I went downstairs to make coffee. The kitchen smelled of warmth and familiarity. Roasted beans, faint traces of rain from the open window. As the machine hummed, I heard her footsteps approach. I didn't turn immediately. I just listened. The rhythm of her movement was steady again, no longer careful or hesitant. "Good morning," she said. When I faced her, Marianne was standing at the doorway, barefoot, her hair tied loosely at the back of her neck. There was no mask, no guarded poise this time, only calm. She looked lighter somehow, as though she'd let go of something heavy. "Coffee?" I asked, gesturing toward the mugs. She smiled, small, genuine. "Only if you promise not to make it too strong." We sat at the small table by the window, the morning light turning her skin golden. For a while, neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. There was a quiet understanding between us, the kind that doesn't require words to be real. Finally, she exhaled softly. "I owe you an apology," she said. "For what?" "For stepping back when I should have just trusted the moment." She paused, eyes tracing the rim of her cup. "I thought distance would make things easier, but it only made everything feel colder." I smiled faintly. Sometimes we build walls thinking they'll protect us. All they do is make the echo louder. Her gaze lifted to mine then, steady and open. "You're wiser than you look. Or just a good listener," I said quietly. That earned a small laugh, a sound I hadn't realized I'd missed until that moment. She reached across the table, her hand brushing mine. It wasn't deliberate at first, just a soft movement. But then she let it stay there, her fingers warm, her touch gentle but sure. "Thank you," she said, "for not pushing, for just being here." Her voice was tender, almost fragile. I turned my hand slightly, letting my thumb rest against her wrist. "You never had to be asked to be cared for," I murmured. "You already were." Outside, the morning light grew brighter, spilling over the floorboards and painting both of us in gold. She leaned back in her chair, eyes half closed, a faint smile still playing on her lips. No grand confession followed, no promises of forever, just a peaceful silence that said enough. When she finally stood to leave, she glanced back once, her tone soft but certain. "Breakfast tomorrow?" I nodded. "I'll bring the coffee. You bring the smirk." She laughed, that quiet, knowing laugh, and for the first time it didn't feel like a challenge. Felt like home. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more slow-burn age gap romances that linger long after the last word. Tell me in the comments, would you have fallen for her too, or tried to keep your distance?